Good evening, everyone. Welcome to this evening's Cotswold Archaeology webinar, where tonight we're going to be talking about life and death on the Dallington Brook archaeological discoveries near Northampton. So just to introduce myself, my name's Tom Brindle, and I'm a Principal Post-Excavation Manager at Cotswold Archaeology, and I'll be hosting this evening's webinar for you. So just before we kick off, I'd like to introduce our speakers. So our first speaker is Joe Barker, and Joe's a post-excavation manager for Cotswold Archaeology based in Milton Keynes, not far from Northampton. She's worked in British commercial archaeology for over 20 years, with most of her career spent in the Southeast Midlands. And Joe's led a range of post-excavation projects, including large prehistoric and Roman sites in Bedfordshire, Northamptonshire and Buckinghamshire. Our next speaker will be Grace Griffith. Grace is a publications officer at CA, also in Milton Keynes, and Grace began her commercial career in 2018 and has worked on a range of field work and post-excavation projects across southern England and the Midlands. And finally, Alex Bliss will be speaking, and he's a metal finds specialist and numismatist who's been with CA as a finds officer since 2022, having previously worked on Historic England's Rosewyke project and previously for the Portable Antiquities scheme. And Alex has a background from childhood field walking, metal detecting, and as a Thames mudlark. And Alex first excavated archaeologically at Barkham Roman Bathhouse in 2010. And in his free time, Alex is an avid enthusiast of medieval churches and real ale. Aren't we all? On that note, I shall hand over to Joe. So please enjoy the seminar.
Good evening, and thank you for joining us. So Cotswold Archaeology carried out this archaeological excavation between 2022 and 23, and we were on site for about a year. The work was undertaken on behalf of Bloor Homes in advance of a 90-hectare residential development known as Halston Park. You can see from this map that we are on the west of New Duston. Northampton's just down here, and then we're bordered by Roman Road to the south and New Sandy Lane to the east. And you can see from the county map where Northampton is in relation to the site, just there. The archaeological site work comprised two excavation areas on either side of the Dallington Brook, and you can see that running east-west across the development area just in the map inset there. We have Area B to the north and Area A to the south. And this photo is a drone shot looking across Area B. So you have Fleetland Farm at the top there, which corresponds to that little cluster of buildings there. The two excavation areas were 10 hectares in total, but as you know, which is a large area. But as you can see, the development area, which is outlined in red here, you can see that there was quite a big area that wasn't subject to open area excavation. But that's because before we arrived on site, there were several stages of archaeological work, which allowed us to assess the archaeological potential of the whole area. So there were three stages of archaeological work before we actually put a spade in the ground. The area was subject to geophysical survey in 2016. And then later that year, we did a trial trench evaluation of the site. And this was to target any geophysical anomalies that had turned up in order to assess whether they are man-made or whether we're looking at natural variations, pockets of just sort of metalwork that's, old bits of tractor or anything like that. And also to test blank areas. It's very important where there's no geophysical anomalies or no crop marks, just to make sure that we have, they are real blank areas and there's no archaeology hiding there. We also undertook a desk-based assessment, and this draws together all the available documentary sources and historical mapping to create a picture of what we could have on site. As part of this desk-based assessment, we looked at the information held by the Northamptonshire historic environment record, such as crop mark data, find spots, and also any archaeological works that have been undertaken in the vicinity. One of the best bits of information we gathered as part of this assessment was the results of the National Mapping Programme undertaken in Northamptonshire. And this programme has been really successful in identifying areas of crop marks, which are the bits marked in orange on this map. Not all of these have been tested through archaeological excavation, but from the layout of many of them, we have a good idea of what they're likely to pertain to. So we know that we're dealing with lots of sort of extensive landscape boundaries, in particular alignments of pits, and they're marked with the squares on the map. There's also a Neolithic causeway enclosure down here, and the more dense areas of crop marks are areas of settlement, and we can see trackways and fields and enclosures within those. And some field walking has been undertaken across this area, and a bit of excavation. So we know that some of these are Iron Age and Roman settlements. You also note that to the south of the development area, there's a Roman road, and that heads off towards Banaventa, fortified Roman settlement over in the northwest of Northamptonshire on the A5 Watling Street, and then continued in this direction towards Duston and then on to Northampton. Another useful piece of information in assessing the archaeological potential of this site was the study of the Midland landscape completed or published in 2011. It used GIS data and documentary sources to map the landscape from the prehistoric times to the 19th century. This is available online, and we will add the link for you so that you can go and find it. It's a really nice piece of data. For our site, they produced a really detailed plan of medieval land use within our development area. So you can see, hopefully, Area B corresponds to an area of medieval ridge and furrow cultivation, whereas Area A corresponds to medieval heathland. And that did play out in the site because we found infilled furrows in Area B, which you can see in this photo. It's just the banding that goes up that way. And in Area A, there weren't any furrows, so that's good evidence. And we also had a neighbouring excavation done several years prior to this one, as part of the New Sandy Lane improvements. And that's a really useful source of information because you can obviously look at the density of archaeology within this road corridor. You can look at the period and also see whether any features are heading into our area. Like this, you can see the inset in the middle, you can see some ditches heading towards our site, this over here. And also a pit alignment, which we did pick up. So this is a zoomed in plan of the excavation area, showing the features we exposed in grey, and the crop marks that we already knew about are in orange. And you can see there's really good correlation between the two. Most of the archaeology we found corresponds to an Iron Age farmstead, but we also have found evidence of human activity dating from the Mesolithic through to the post-medieval period. And my colleague Grace Griffith will talk to you about that in just a moment. Following the completion of the excavation on site, we spent the last year processing the site data, and this has helped us to identify particular features and finds and environmental material that needs looking at in more detail at the next stage, which is the analysis stage. Before I hand over to Grace, I was just going to mention that on Saturday, we have an open day at our Milton Keynes office, and we will have more information and some of the finds from the site on display. You don't need to book, you can just turn up, and we will put those details on the webinar at the end as well. So I'll hand you over to Grace now, who will talk you through the site, what we found, what periods we found. Thank you.
Thanks, Jo. Hi, everyone. So I'm just going to talk to you a bit about what we found on the site and what periods of activity they correspond to. So As Joe mentioned, the archaeological potential of the site had already been highlighted by trial trench evaluation, geophysical survey, and the crop marks identified within the site boundary. These two plans show the results of the fieldwork, with the archaeological features shown in black on these. Area A is on the left here, and Area B is on the right. These plans highlight the amount of archaeology identified during the fieldwork, and we can see that similar levels of archaeology were present on either side of the brook. It's also possible to identify similar organisational layouts and types of features across both areas. The archaeology identified corresponded to 8 periods of activity, the majority of which, but not all, were represented in both areas A and B. I'll give a brief overview of each of these periods of activity, discussing how the site changed during each phase. The earliest evidence for human activity corresponds to the prehistoric period and comprised 4 dispersed pits located in Area A, which are shown on this plan by the black arrows, and an example is shown in the photograph on the left-hand side of the slide. The term prehistoric is quite broad, however, the work flint assemblages recovered from these features ranged from Mesolithic to early Neolithic in date, such as the leaf-shaped arrowhead shown in the photograph in the lower left hand of the slide here. Other prehistoric work flint was recovered from the site, aside from these 4 pits, but these were not in stratified deposits, i.e. the finds were not contemporaneous with the feature or deposit they were recovered from, but were residual within later features and deposits on the site. No prehistoric activity was definitively identified within Area B. However, a small amount of early Neolithic pottery was recovered from a pit in Area B, and currently post-excavation work is undergoing to determine if there is any more activity associated with this date. Evidence for Middle Bronze Age activity comprised 2 groups of cremation burials, one in Area A, shown on the left here, and one in Area B, shown on the right. Some similarities and differences can be observed between the 2 areas. The cremation cemetery in Area A was formed of 3 distinct clusters of cremation burials, of which 11 can be considered to be deliberate burials which contained cremated human bone, and a further 5 contained a very small quantity of what could be human or animal burnt bone. The cremations in Area B were of very different nature, comprising 3 dispersed cremations and a potentially related pit, which were spread across a larger area and are shown by the black arrows on the plan on the right. Additionally, the weights of the cremated bone recovered from the features in Area B was notably greater than most of the Area A cremation burials. 2 samples of cremated human bone from Area A and 3 samples from Area B were radiocarbon dated and all produced Middle Bronze Age dates. 3 of the burials in Area A contained sherds of Middle Bronze Age pottery, which potentially corresponded to burial urns. The most convincing of these is shown in the photograph in the top right here and is under excavation on the left. However, the burials in both areas had been heavily truncated, only surviving to a shallow depth. A comparison of the survival depth can be seen on the right-hand side of the slide, with the cremation for Area B shown in the lower right corner. Due to this very shallow depth, it's possible that more were urned burials which have been removed by later activity, possibly corresponding to the agricultural activity on the site. The only finds recovered from the Area B cremations comprised 1 flint flake. The earliest evidence of settlement-related activity within the excavation areas occurred during the Iron Age. In places, radiocarbon dating results, the pottery assemblage, and the stratigraphic sequence suggest that 3 phases of Iron Age activity were present, which is shown on the plan to the right of the screen here. I'll now discuss the activity corresponding to each of these 3 phases. The early Iron Age was defined by 2 pit alignments, one each in Area A and B. Though a predominantly Middle to Late Iron Age pottery assemblage was recovered from the pit alignments, radiocarbon dating of a pit in alignment A returned an early Iron Age date, which is consistent with other better dated pit alignments in Northamptonshire. It's likely that the pit alignments were established during the earlier Iron Age, though potentially remained open into the Middle to Late Iron Age. Pit alignment A, shown on the left here, was defined by a northeast-southwest line of 48 pits, which spanned approximately 240 metres along the northern edge of Area A. Pit alignment B, shown on the right here, had a northwest-southeast orientation and comprised 59 pits, which extended for approximately 214 metres. Unlike pit alignment A, alignment B was an almost continuous line of pits. The pits were each of similar sizes and shapes, and examples of the features are shown in these two photographs, with a pit from area A shown in the upper photograph on the left-hand side of the photograph, and one from area B in the lower photograph on the right-hand side of the photograph. In both instances, the pits have been cut by later phase 3.2 and phase 3.3 boundary ditches, which you can see on the right and left accordingly. The first phase of Middle to Late Iron Age activity was only identified in Area B and comprised evidence of settlement and landscape organisation, including 6 enclosures, 7 ring gullies, and discrete pits and post holes. Several enclosures appeared to have been influenced by the position of earlier pit alignment B. 4 ring gullies were situated within the central portion of Area B. They each had the same southeast-facing entrances and appeared to be arranged in pairs, comprising a larger ring gully paired with a smaller one. The depths of the ditches that form the ring gullies were broadly comparable, as shown by the photographs on the left-hand side of the slide here. It's likely that the ring gullies were associated with drainage rather than being structural. 2 pits, each cut by a post hole, were associated with ring gully B1, which is circled in blue on this plan, and they are shown on the photographs on this slide. The features were notable due to their location. The pits were situated internally to the ring ditch on either side of the entrance and possibly formed doorposts. As you can see in these photographs, each of the post holes contained a single large stone, which potentially represents a post pad to support a structure or a post associated with an entrance structure. Also of note was D-shaped enclosure B3, which was located in the eastern half of Area B, as circled on this plan. The ditch defining this enclosure had been recut at least 6 times on roughly the same course. Of particular note was a human cranium, teeth, fragments of disarticulated human femur, cremated bone and animal bone, which was recovered from one of the later recuts of the enclosure ditch, approximately where the blue circle is on this photograph. No clear grave cut was identified within the ditch, indicating that the bones may have been from a disturbed burial. Radiocarbon dating of one of the incisors produced a Middle Iron Age date. Interestingly, just above this deposit, human bone of the cremated remains of a child aged approximately 3 years old were deposited within the upper fill of the enclosure ditch, approximately where the upper blue circle is. Radiocarbon dating on this bone produced a slightly later date of Middle to Late Iron Age, suggesting the ditch was open in this later period. The third phase of Iron Age activity comprised another sequence of enclosures in Area A and B, which in places truncated the earlier enclosures identified in Area B, though produced predominantly Middle to Late Iron Age pottery assemblages. The enclosures were more regular in layout and were generally square or rectangular in shape. Numerous pits and post holes were situated within the interior and immediately outside of the enclosures, and a possible track grate was identified along the southern boundary of Area B. Some of the pits, such as that in the photograph on the left, which was in Area A, were very similar to types of pits commonly found on Iron Age sites in this region, which are considered to have a crop storage function. An assemblage of charred grain was recovered from this feature, which may represent dumped domestic or crop processing material. The enclosure ditches were also very substantial, such as the one depicted in the photograph on the right, which was in Area B. They often had multiple natural silting fills, which produced relatively small artefact assemblages. Of particular note was a small sub-enclosure situated in the southeastern corner of enclosure B6, located here on the plan of Area B, circled in blue again. The feature was defined by a subcircular ditch that had an internal diameter of 3.5 metres, and a west-facing entrance was indicated by a 2-metre wide gap in the ditch, just here on this photograph. Within the ditch, a stone-built layer, which followed the course of the ring gully, likely formed a foundation for a circular building, which you can just see in this photograph here as I'm outlining with the laser pointer. Late Iron Age to early Roman activity was notably different in character to that of the period 3 enclosures and features. It was characterised by several enclosure systems which were much larger and less well defined than the period 3 features. However, some spatial correlations between the period 3 and 4 features were evident, with the period 4 ditches respecting some of the period 3 enclosures, particularly in area A, such as this ditch here, which seems to bend around the earlier enclosure on both sides here. And it may suggest that some remnant of these earlier features remained in the landscape at this time. Roman activity on the site was limited to one feature in area A, which was identified as a Roman flare kiln. The substantial structure comprised a large subcircular charge chamber at the western end of the feature and an elongated flue or working area at the eastern end, which was connected to the charge chamber by a stone-built flue. The charge chamber measured approximately 4.2 meters in diameter and 2.35 meters deep. Within the interior of the chamber, the upper portion of the structure comprised heat-affected clay walls, which gradually tapered in diameter. At a depth of approximately 1 meter, an internal lining had been constructed of large irregular limestone blocks, which continued the gradual taper of the chamber to form a bowl-shaped structure with an unlined clay base. This map shows the location of several of the kilns located within the county. Those at Priors Hall, Weekley and Hardwick Park are all Roman in date, and that at Fleetland Farm is post-medieval and is situated within the northern part of the development site, as Joe pointed out earlier. Notably, a large depression on first edition OS mapping of the farm is labelled lime kiln. And just a heads up, there's an image of human bone on the following slide. Evidence for early medieval to Anglo-Saxon activity comprised one early to middle Anglo-Saxon pit dated by radiocarbon methods. It was situated in Area B, which is shown on the plan here by the green arrow, and it was cut into the top of a period 4 enclosure ditch. The pit contained a human skull, as shown in the photograph on the left, of a male individual. No other artefacts were associated with the burial, and no further features of Anglo-Saxon date were identified on the site. So that's provided a very quick overview of the features identified during the excavation, and as Joe mentioned, there is more post-excavation work to be done, which will no doubt provide further information on the lives of the people who lived and worked here. I'll now hand over to Alex, who'll provide some in-depth information about the metalwork finds recovered from the site.
There we go. Right. Good evening, everybody. Really pleased to be presenting to you this evening some of the metal small finds recovered from the site during excavation. Yes, some of the metal small finds from the site. So to give you a summary, across the areas of excavation A and B combined, there were a total of 34 sort of metal objects recovered. And the vast majority of these, 25 in fact, were manufactured from iron, with a much smaller input of copper alloy objects, 7 of those, a singular lead object and a singular aluminium object, which, as I'm sure you can imagine, is not of particular antiquity. And some of these finds were recovered from topsoil via sort of metal detecting of spoil and during sort of stripping of surfaces. But an awful lot of it, this material, was excavated from formal archaeological features. And where we can date those features, the sort of period in which most of the metalwork sort of concentrates in terms of what sort of phase it comes from is period 3 to 3.3, so middle to late Iron Age 2. As you can imagine, being mostly manufactured from iron, the metalwork assemblage it was largely quite poorly preserved. This material really does not do well in the ground, and as you'll see from the sort of X-ray plate on the right, that's how we tend to examine a lot of the ironwork from sort of sites. It is via digital X-ray plates, which really help us sort of work out what encrusted lumps of iron actually are, what is hidden within them. Quite a lot of the finds from areas A and B were undiagnostic, and when I sort of say that, I mean that they're sort of hard to identify both in terms of function and date. This is in some cases because the objects are you know, that they're undiagnostic object types like nails, which being functional have a very long use life through history. And in other instances, it was because the objects were sort of scraps of, quite literally scraps of iron that really, you know, you couldn't really work out what they were at all. Some of the objects, however, could be definitively related to relatively modern use of the landscape. And although most of these were found in the topsoil, there were some that had actually become sort of intrusive. When I say intrusive, I mean that they had gotten into archaeological features, which can be slightly confusing. So I note on the screen there, if you have a look at the C-shaped object on the X-ray plate with the label 11206, that C-shaped object perplexed me for some time because it came out of an Iron Age pit, but it looked rather weird. And my colleague Mike Green here in Suffolk was able to confirm to me that this is a link from an agricultural ratchet chain. So, you know, this is an agricultural object that may explain how it got into the ground in the first instance and how it ended up getting into a feature it really shouldn't have in the first instance. So I've selected a few specific finds to discuss with you tonight, there's 6 in total, which I think are really interesting and it's a really nice story sort of regarding the site and its inhabitants. So we're going to start off with what I reckon is, I think this is the star find from the excavation, and one which I think is definitely being displayed at the open day this weekend, which was from Area A. And this is the copper alloy barbed and tanged arrowhead. A really amazing find that probably dates to the Middle Bronze Age. This find was recovered unstratified, unfortunately, via metal detecting, but it was very close to period 3.3 enclosure A8, which is, you can see, is marked down there on the bottom. Really lovely object, typically arrow-shaped, triangular, most of them are, with really nicely made tang and barbs there with that sort of deep in-cutting. Very, very thin object, slightly rounded on one face and flat on the other, which may imply that it was actually cast in an open mould. And as you'll see by this highlighted picture here, you can see on this object these striations, which I think relate to the sort of the final working and sort of polishing and sort of the object when it was being made. I cannot emphasize enough these barbed and tanged copper alloy arrowheads. I mean, barbed and tanged arrowheads, mostly in prehistory, you think of flint, you think of the early Bronze Age, the beaker arrowheads. But to find them in copper alloy is really very rare. And it's very rare to find them in this country as well. There are just over 30 examples of copper alloy barbed and tanged arrowheads that I've been able to collate together from Britain. Most of those have sort of relatively accurate find spot data. A few of these finds are sort of antiquarian recoveries from the sort of sort of 19th, 20th centuries, but a lot of the ones that have emerged recently result from metal detecting and have been recorded by the Portable Antiquities Scheme, which has really helped fill out our understanding of these objects. As you'll see from the distribution map there, their major sort of distribution sort of focus is in kind of the southwest and in East Anglia. There's almost a line of them running northeast across the country, and this is quite interesting, I think, because these are 2 regions of the country in the Middle Bronze Age, especially in the southwest, where you get a lot of hoarding of Bronze Age metalwork. Less so in East Anglia during the Middle Bronze Age, but in the Late Bronze Age, the focus moves away from sort of the southwest and towards that part of the world. You'll see there as well that I've marked on South Wales, there is a little triangular dot and it says Pennard Hoard. And the reason I've marked that down there is because there is only one of these arrowheads known from a stratified archaeological context, to my knowledge. If anyone knows of any others that I might have missed, then please do say. Hopefully I've been accurate in collating them all. But that stratified find comes from the Pennard Hoard, which was discovered in the early years of the 19th century. And it dates to the very end of the Middle Bronze Age. So it's probably buried somewhere around sort of 1275 to 1140 BC. So very, really close to sort of the Middle Bronze Age, late Bronze Age transition. these objects, they are, as I said, they are rare in Britain, and but arrowheads are more sort of commonly found on the continent. And it was initially thought that these objects, when they were found, especially sort of the first few examples that emerged, that they might be antiquarian losses or sort of foreign imports from overseas. But there is a growing body of evidence. This growing number of finds now suggests that actually the deposition of these artifacts is a legitimate British thing, though they are still very rare. There are similarities between, I've just included a couple of other examples from the Portable Antiquity scheme. These objects have real similarity in many respects with the forms of sort of Bronze Age flint arrowheads that date to a little bit earlier. We've said that these copper alloy arrowheads are probably Middle Bronze Age, but these nicely made flint examples are a little bit earlier than that, early Bronze Age. And I guess there are several ways we can interpret that. If we go down the functional argument, we can say that, well, arrowheads have always been, pretty much the same form throughout history. They've generally been pointy at one end, not pointy at the other, so you can, fire them and hit your target. And maybe this is coincidental. But in some cases, the designs do seem very close to the flint ones. Are they copying them? Are they imitating them? Were people aware of sort of these objects lying around and decided to sort of follow the form, or have we potentially got the date wrong? Are these copper alloy arrowheads actually early Bronze Age? Do they date a bit before we think they do? And just because the sole stratified example of one of these objects was found in a late Middle Bronze, it doesn't mean it has to be late Middle Bronze Age. This object could have been curated, in that hoard. It could have been held onto long after it was actually made. And I think, in sort of reference to the example from our site, that's important to see in the context of the intense Middle to Late Iron Age occupation. Does this item represent an unstratified Middle Bronze Age loss, or was it actually held onto by the people who occupied the site? Was it brought with them? Did it belong to them in the Middle to Late Iron Age? And there are several instances of Bronze Age objects. It's not a common practice, certainly, but there are several instances of Bronze Age objects being held onto by people in the Iron Age and curated and buried. A good example of this is in the very late Iron Age Lexton tumulus in Essex, which is a probable royal late Iron Age burial. There was a Middle Bronze Age pole stave axe in that. An item that at the time of burial was 1,500 years old, yet ended up in the burial of a late Iron Age elite individual. So people had an awareness of these objects, and it's not difficult to see how they could sort of stick around and be perhaps held on to as talismans or curiosities even. So, having talked about the arrowhead, the star find, we're moving on to some of the other objects from the site, and one of a really nice item from Area A, deposited in this time in a feature, so actually stratified, is this really quite remarkably complete iron knife, which was from pit 10877. And this is one of a small sort of group of pits that were kind of dispersed across Area A, dating to period 3.3, and they were sort of, as I said, sort of between the enclosures. And this particular knife was recovered from its sort of feature with alongside an assemblage of pottery dating from the middle to the sort of late Iron Age. Really lovely object. Absolutely, pretty intact, really. It's got a hooked blade. The blade itself is triangular in cross sections. This is a single-edged knife. The sort of the tang, the handle, the rivets survive really well. The tang handle is sort of flat, and then you have two rivets stuck through it to secure the original side plates, enabling it to be held. And those side plates probably would have been manufactured from wood or bone, perhaps more likely to survive here. These are objects, this is again, from a period probably sort of Middle Iron Age to Late Iron Age. And here's quite a nice comparison for it. Please excuse the slightly crude cropping from the monograph here. The plates were difficult to sort of arrange, but very similar knife here with that similar hooked blade and flat tang which comes from Danebury Hill Fort in Hampshire. And this particular example is late Iron Age. They're ceramic period 7, so sort of probably 1st century BC in that regard. Another nice complete object came from Area B, and specifically the outer ditch of one of the of enclosure B5. Again, period 3.3, middle to late Iron Age. And this object probably represents, I'm pretty sure, an awl. And awls are sort of leather working tools. They're used for piercing. They're used for sort of they're practical tools, just as the knife is. You know, and here's a selection of reasonably sort of similar kind of items, which are also from Danebury. And these two objects are very interesting in the sense that they're both relatively complete and they've both been deposited in features. Now, on the one hand, we can say, oh, well, this is obviously functional deposition of household rubbish. This is people chucking stuff away. This is unwanted items being thrown out. But perhaps given that they're both complete, we can introduce a bit more nuance here. And we can sort of say that actually what might be an alternative interpretation is there is the possibility that these were buried deliberately and intentionally so. You know, there is this idea in the Iron Age that you get structured depositions, you get the deliberate burial of objects, not just metalwork, but also pottery and other items, you know, in certain locations for reasons that, you know, not totally sure on. There seems to be some symbolic significance. So we've got sort of those two angles there, the functional, you know, rubbish disposal, or the non-functional symbolic disposal, and pick whichever one you will. I'm not going to either on either side. Moving on a little bit, staying in area B, we've got this this is I think the smallest object I'm going to sort of discuss with you tonight. This really fine copper alloy wire ring, which was recovered from grave 21497. This was a very disturbed double inhumation of an adult and a child, very, very fragmented, very, very disturbed, dating again, as with many, as I've said, with many of the metal objects, to period 3.3, that middle late Iron Age sort of time span. And this was associated with that burial. And, you know, it's one of those objects, can't be totally sure of exactly what it is. It could be an earring, an ornament of some kind, but it's really difficult. It's very fragmented, and as you can see, they're very small. So now I've placed it next to some slightly similar, some similar objects from a site called Thorpe Thools, which is in Cleveland, and that was an Iron Age settlement. And some of the objects recovered there included spiral finger rings, which are quite a characteristic, very sort of late Iron Age sort of fashion, but also these simple wire rings, as you'll see on the bottom right there, which may have functioned as earrings. It's very difficult. We can't always be certain of what these objects are, but perhaps earring is or some kind of little ornament is not inappropriate in this instance. And this is an item which seemed to be associated with that double inhumation, so it represents, you know, possible grave good in that context. Moving on, skipping forward now into slightly in time. So we've been dealing with sort of stuff that's kind of sort of middle late Iron Age, and now we're going to move into something which is late Iron Age crossing into the Roman. And this really nice little bow brooch, which came from Area B in ditch BH. And this is quite interesting because this is actually this feature is actually unphased. We're not quite sure what date it was. It was, I think, the only find from this particular ditch. But immediately to the north of it, the enclosure B8 was sort of period 4, so crossing the late Iron Age Roman transition. So it may well, and that kind of fits quite well in this instance, because this brooch was probably made and used somewhere in the period of about AD 25 to sort of 60. It's what we call a Colchester type brooch. It's not complete. Here it's sort of its views expanded. It has suffered a little bit in the soil. Here's a complete one. This is what a complete one looks like. So this example was not found at the site. This is just to show what sort of the principal features of what these complete brooches look like. Colchester brooches, they're pretty widespread. We find them across sort of eastern and central England. And as I say, they date across that late Iron Age Roman transition. They have a very sort of stubby winged head. a catch plate, which can sometimes be open work with those sort of holes cut through them for decoration. And the pin and spring is made from a single length of copper alloy wire that's basically looped through that front-facing hook you see on the side of the brooch, and then sort of attaches along the back. So they're practical sort of clothing fasteners, and sort of just the sort of item that you really might expect to find if you've got people sort of walking, moving around a site. These things, you know, do tend to fall off clothes and cloaks with regularity. We do tend to find rather a lot of them. So, you know, it's the sort of thing that you might find, and sort of that might get, you know, dropped, lost, and then potentially incorporated into an archaeological feature, which happens quite often. And just as the last one, it would be rude not to mention that the singular Roman coin from the site as well, which it was unstratified from area A, but again, not too far from the arrowhead, actually, close to enclosure A8. It is a Roman coin. It's pretty illegible, and it's the singular sort of securely Roman metal find from the site. It's a bronze coin. It's reasonably large. It's probably a sort of 1st or 2nd century Roman coin, and these are not uncommon discoveries in Britain. But when found, that they can be quite difficult to say anything from them on a sort of singular basis, because they circulated for quite long periods of time. So you have bronze coins arriving in Britain sort of in the late sort of 1st century AD that could have really circulated right up to the sort of 3rd century AD, right up to sort of, you know, AD 200 and on, because that sort of, they sort of continued to, they sort of persisted, and we get very worn coins being deposited that obviously underwent intense circulation. So, you know, it's indicative that the Romans are around, but it's the singular Roman find, so it's not, we're obviously not in sort of the main sort of area of focus in that period where we are. So to sum up the metal objects, it's a real sort of slice through time. You see we've got objects here from sort of the Middle Bronze Age, the Iron Age, and the Roman period. I mean, realistically covering potentially a period of some, you know, 1200 to 1300 years. Most of the metalwork comes from period 3.3 deposits, which I think reflects the sort of, you know, the intensity of occupation during this period. But of course, as I've said, these items do not necessarily have to have been thrown away, particularly the knife and the awl. These are objects which could potentially have been buried deliberately for sort of various reasons. None of these objects is particularly, you know, well, except for the arrowhead, which is quite sort of unprecedented and unusual discovery. The remainder of the sort of metalwork assemblages are fairly ordinary, everyday items that sort of have a practical application. And, you know, you might think, well, the assemblage is relatively small. You know, you've only got sort of 30 items. For sort of Middle Iron Age sites, it's not uncommon, you know, that the metalwork assemblages be relatively small. And it seems that, you know, not much ironwork was being deposited on sites in the Middle Iron Age. Perhaps there was, you know, a desire to keep hold of it and it for sort of be recycled quite intensively. And as I've just said, the singular Roman coin, you know, it sort of mirrors the other, apart from the lime kiln, the sort of the lack of general sort of Roman activity within the site's catchment. You know, it's something that results from some sporadic ad hoc loss, maybe dropped from someone's pocket. You know, it indicates occupation in the surrounding area, but not particularly intensively.
Well, thanks, Alex. So, well, thank you to all three of the speakers, to Joe, Grace, and Alex, for each of their fascinating contributions to this evening's webinar. I think you'll all agree that that was really, really fascinating. I'd also like to extend our thanks to the Cotswold Archaeology field team, who all worked so hard, obviously, in the field, undertaking the field work, which enabled us to actually bring these findings to light and allow us to talk about these sorts of things. And of course, last but not least, to Blore Holmes, who funded the field work and the ongoing post-excavation analysis. Thanks to those of you, thanks to all of you for listening, and to those of you who have put in some questions into the Q&A box. Before we move on to the questions, I'd like to introduce you to Liz Mordew, who is going to join us on the Q&A panel. Liz is the lead planning archaeologist for Northamptonshire. She covers North Northamptonshire and West Northamptonshire unitary authorities. And Liz provides archaeological advice and guidance on a whole range of development schemes across Northamptonshire, basically just making sure that archaeology is done correctly, that sort of thing. For this site, Liz was responsible for monitoring the fieldwork, and she continues to advise and monitor the post-excavation analysis and publication work as it continues. So let's move on now to our questions. We've got a question from Ian Sillers. I hope I'm pronouncing that okay. Do we have any ideas what the two pit alignments were used for? I'll pass that to Grace initially, I guess, or no, or to Joe. Joe's stepping in.
It's a subject of much debate, really, what pit alignments are for. I suppose it ranges from functional to maybe ritual. They're often in Northamptonshire, they're often associated with watercourses, like our two. So they could be boundary. I mean, our ones, we think that they run along the edge of the floodplain, demarcating that. So maybe in times of sort of high water, maybe it's a good sign that it is quite a flooded area. But they could also be, I mean, seen as symbolic because there were gaps between the pits, so they weren't a sort of, a continuous boundary stopping sort of people being able to move across them. So there's lots of different theories based on, where they're found. Some of them are replaced by actual ditch boundaries in the Iron Age as well, so making them more sort of, definitive boundaries that can't be crossed easily, I suppose.
Yeah, really interesting how the pit alignments at this site really clearly influenced the later development of the landscape, didn't they? You see that sort of continuity of those ditches being extended throughout the Iron Age, and then actually even into the post-medieval period, you can see the ridge and furrow is clearly following those sort of alignments. They had a profound influence, obviously going over millennia, which is quite phenomenal. Thanks very much, Joe.
Yeah, it's a really nice theme we'll be looking at.
Yeah, really interesting. Another question from Leslie Galloway from Leighton Buzzard. What is a charge chamber?
Shall I jump in on this one? So a charge chamber would be where all of the fuel would be put inside the lime kiln to burn and cause the furnace inside to be lit, and that's where all the like charcoal rich deposits we find are. It would be fed air through the flue, which was stone built in this instance. And it's also where potentially any crops would be put to dry, or pottery, etc. Whatever the kiln was used for would be in that charge chamber.
Thanks, Grace. I've got a question. We're still waiting for a few more questions to come in. So you obviously showed some really interesting cremation burials from the Bronze Age phases of the site. Were the burials exclusively cremation burials at this time, or did you have any evidence for any other types of burial at all? Did you have any inhumation burials at all? Was it mixed burial rite or simply cremation?
For the Middle Bronze Age period, we only found the cremation burials, so that was the only indication, and they seem to form what is coined as flat cemeteries. So there was no evidence for a burial monument associated with those Middle Bronze Age cremations that we found during the excavations and during the fieldwork. Whereas in the Iron Age, we found a mixture of cremations and inhumations, some of which seemed to be formal. So Alex mentioned there was potentially a double inhumation, whereas, like I mentioned in the ditches, it seemed to be almost a disturbed burial of a mixture of human and animal, and inhumation and cremation. So there's obviously a lot of different practices going on in the site within quite a short time frame, really.
Right. Okay. That's really interesting. Thanks, Grace. Yes, Joe.
Yeah, I was just going to point out as well that it's not unusual to find bits of disarticulated human bone in Iron Age ditches and pits. So it's very much the norm for that period.
Okay, thank you. I guess more of a sort of general question. Obviously, things seem to peter out by the end of the Iron Age, and it seems that we don't have a great deal of evidence for Roman activity at the site. I don't. Maybe this is more of a question for Liz, who obviously knows the area really well. What's going on in the Roman period, Liz? Then, you know, are people moving somewhere else?
It does seem to be that there is a shift during the Roman period away from that area. We do know of a fairly substantial Roman settlement just a little way down the hill towards Harpole, which has been partly investigated so far and is going to be further investigated in the near future. So yeah, they're moving around. They're not necessarily staying in the same place. They're shifting where they live. Of course, Duston as well. There is Roman settlement in Duston, which unfortunately was largely quarried away in the 19th century. But I think they're possibly concentrating a little more into more formal grouped settlements and towns rather than having the individual farmsteads which we get in the Iron Age.
Okay, you've sort of started to answer some of the questions that are appearing now. So a question from Tim Yates: are there Roman sites associated with the Roman road? I recollect Roman industrial activity near Duston. So I suppose, yes, perhaps you're getting a shift more towards the sites, you know, as the Roman roads are created, you're getting more of a concentration towards those linear
Yes.
routeways.
Yes, exactly. Yes. And we've also got dotted about, we've got a few Roman villas. There's one just up a long Roman road at Nobottle. There's a Roman villa. And there's one or two others dotted about in the landscape as well. So we've got more of a mixture of types of settlement activity than we tend to get in the Iron Age.
Okay. And another question for you, I guess, Liz, partly or largely. So from Hamish, the excavated areas appear to have concentrated on the brook rather than the Roman road. So how were the excavation areas decided? So this is, I guess, a bit of a planning question. You know, how do you decide where we're going to excavate on these sites before development?
Well, essentially, it's based on the data from the evaluation. So Joe showed us the images of the trenching, and we also had information from geophysics. So the entire site was evaluated, and then we kind of reduced down to the area where the archaeology is for the actual mitigation. And this is completely normal for these kind of developments. They're very, very large sites. It's very rare that there's going to be archaeology over all of it. In fact, it's almost unheard of. There are always going to be bits where you need to do work and bits that are fine. It was evaluated down to the Roman road, and there was nothing alongside the road. And again, there isn't archaeology everywhere. They have to be keeping their sheep and their cows somewhere. So there isn't going to be archaeology in every single field. And that's sort of how it works. We just work on the evaluation and draw a line round where the archaeology is, and those are the bits that we excavate.
Thank you very much, Liz. So Janet Blythe has a question for Alex. On the distribution map of arrowheads, is it my imagination or does it follow the line of the ridgeway?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. I'm just having another look at my distribution map now to sort of refamiliar myself. Yeah, it's interesting. I presume would that be the sort of the southwestern ridgeway, the Dorset ridgeway? Sorry, I'm not quite sure which ridgeway that would be. Yeah, there is that kind of sort of strange kind of line of them in South Wiltshire. But there really aren't very many of these objects, and with such a small sample size, I'm especially sort of looking on the individual county level. I'd be loath to kind of extrapolate too much of that from the very, very few examples. Certainly, they have that sort of southwestern focus, as I mentioned, but it's not something I haven't quite got down into the nitty gritty of looking at sort of like an inter-county level. yeah, it is interesting, and there does almost seem to be like there is sort of almost a linear kind of aspect to the sort of the overall distribution, where you can also almost join the dots between the southwestern and the East Anglian ones. But I'm not sure that's a sort of a genuine pattern. That might be slightly like ley lines drawing points between a couple of points. Yeah, I'm not too that one. I might have to come back to you on and have a look in more detail. But yeah, clearly they have a focus in the southwest for certain, and East Anglia.
And are you fairly confident that that's a real distribution? Because of course a lot of these are
Yes,
metal detector
yeah.
finds, and metal detecting, you can have kind of extreme bias, particularly towards the sort of southeast and the southwest, and in terms of metal detecting, it is less frequent in the northwest and in the west, where you have much more past and you do agricultural land. Do you think that might have an impact on it at all?
It's a very valid point. Yeah, and I think it's definitely worth considering. It'll be worth considering down the line. I'm slightly surprised. There don't seem to be any from the kind of southeastern counties. So sort of, and by which I mean sort of Sussex, and Kent and Hampshire. Actually, I'm kind of surprised there aren't really any from there. Quite a few of the East Anglian finds, interestingly, were antiquarian discoveries. They were things that had been known about sort of since I think the early sort of 1900s, as was one of the Wiltshire finds, which came from Swallowcliffe Down, I believe, and it is quite an early find. Yes, certainly that sort of lack, sort of the biasing factor of not having as much sort of metal detecting in the northwest could well sort of be part of the reason why there is that sort of gigantic hole on the map. But they do have an interesting distribution, and I do find it very strange that there's this one solitary example that has ended up going on holiday to Wales, and ended up in the Pennard Hall, and it sort of outlies all the other ones. It's certainly food for thought, looking down to sort of for final analysis.
And it's interesting, isn't it? Because they do seem to be so rare that it's hard to. I don't know. They clearly weren't sort of in everyday use, were they? These must have been really quite significant, important objects. Do we think that they are being deliberately deposited? You may well have touched on that actually a bit earlier, but we don't see them all over the place, do we? So they're not just being lost during hunting. They're obviously not that common.
No, I don't think they're sort of in widespread use, or I think we'd find a lot more of them, and they do seem to be, arrowheads seem to have this in the Bronze Age, seem to have this kind of closer affinity with the continent, that they're much more sort of common over that part of the world in the Bronze Age. What is interesting is, I think would be an interesting angle, is to actually look at the metallurgy of them. If one could sort of get a project together to look at the metallurgy of these objects and see if they're actually locally made, or if it's actually they are potentially imports. I have read anecdotally that the example in the Pennard Hoard did apparently have slightly strange kind of metallurgy, which may have hinted that it actually was an import. It wasn't made in this country; it came from somewhere else. But it has that Bronze Age context, so it's not it's not been dropped in the 19th century by someone returning from somewhere that you do find prehistoric Bronze Age arrowheads, like so they're quite well known from France, Germany, Switzerland, the sort of the core areas of where they're known on the continent.
Yeah, interesting. Okay, so if any of our listeners have got absolutely bags of cash, they want to throw a research project, there's a potential idea for them. I think that's the end of the questions we have, unless there are any other final questions that anyone wants to put in the chat. Doesn't look like it. So really, then, just a final thank you all for attending. I hope you found tonight's webinar interesting. I certainly did, and I thought our speakers did a fantastic job. So thank you very much, and good evening to you all. Thanks.